We are. We're starting on the. We're starting the Merchant and Craft Guild.
Oh, that looks like me.
Oh, yeah, Michael Scott.
You own Merchant and Craft.
Now, we were talking about the creation of towns when we left off last time. And as people began to have more freedom to set up their own businesses and set up their own shops, there became competition within these towns. So sometimes competition can lead to a really good thing. When you have two different bakeries who are making excellent donuts.
Are you talking about like Walgreens and CVS?
No, they're not bakery. What? They make
No, we're
their
talking like flour mill and
Mary
Dunkin'
Lou's.
Donuts.
Okay.
Mary Lou's is trash. It does not exist.
What are you talking about?
I think we should practice.
Hey, shut up, all of you.
Power word.
Let's be careful of our words.
Sorry. Be quiet,
Use-
all of y'all.
Do we have to tell you?
Please.
Let's also make sure we are practicing what we are preaching. Now,
Be kind. Shut up.
Gavin,
Sorry.
thank you.
Using some power.
As we talked about at the beginning today, let's make sure that we are focused where we ought to focus. Thank you. Now, we were talking about competition, so it can be a good thing. So if we use the two bakeries, we use Flour Mill and Mary Lou Donuts as an example because I think that it just makes sense to me. So we can have two different bakeries selling similar items. While you may have a preference for which one you think may be better, ultimately these two companies are vying for your money and are competing to try to get your business on that particular day. The chances of you going to both locations in a single day is very slim. Not impossible, and it could be done, but most likely if you're going to go get donuts, you're going to pick one place for that day. So that's one of my favorite things to do on a Saturday morning is to take my kids and go get donuts at one of those two locations. And
Do you see Joe Bravo?
so
Or Mason?
I've seen them a couple of times in there, yep.
Joe Bravo.
So when we go pick one of those locations, it kind of depends on a number of factors. It depends on do I feel like driving all the way over to Reeseville, or do I feel like just staying here in town? Reeseville's back in Wisconsin. Yeah, Rossville. So yeah, that's where it's at. I'm also going to take in consideration the different styles of donuts that they have and what I'm in the mood for. So with these craft guilds, you'd have a couple different people vying for the same customers. And many times they worked together and they realized that if they could produce high quality products and have a little variation, then they could still stay in business together. And there's room enough for more than one bakery in town. That doesn't always work, but it can. So they started to form these guilds that regulated the business activity within the town. And the purpose of these guilds was to ensure that there was high quality products being made, so in this case donuts, that everybody who was part of this guild was going to agree to have a certain level of quality, certain product that they were going to put out. And you had to be part of the craft guild in order to be able to do business in that town. And these guilds would often do other things such as create schools. They would do things to benefit the entire town, care for the poor, care for the widows, care for orphans. They would take some of their profits and they would put the money back into the betterment of society. Now, there were two different types of guilds. First one is the Merchant Guild that allowed for that particular merchant to have a monopoly on the town's trade. So if you had a baker in town and he was part of the Merchant Guild, they could come to an agreement and they would say that, Justin, you are the only baker that we are going to allow in this town. So you have a monopoly, which means that if Libby walks into town and she says, hey, I'm a baker.
Oh, heck no.
Then Justin's going to say, and the rest of us, as part of the guild, are going to say, sorry, Libby, we already have a baker.
Yeah, Libby.
We don't want another one because we're afraid that might hurt Justin's business. And Libby may come to us and she may say, well, I can bake better than Justin, and I would bring more money into the town if you would let me into the guild. And then we as a entire organization would have to decide, are we going to let her in?
We'd have a
Are we going to
bake-off.
have a bake-off
Oh yeah.
between the two of you?
You think
Tried
you
all
would
my
win?
cookies.
You think you can beat me? I am a master at
I'm
bake
certain
donuts.
Hey,
Oh,
what?
Hey,
alright. I
now-
can make donut holes.
Justin, we are digressing away from the point.
I can make donut
So
holes.
the guild was a very exclusive group. If you could be part of the guild, then you were endorsed by the rest of the businesses in the town, and you could make a good amount of money. If you were not part of it, then it was really difficult to get in. Now, if Libby wanted to come up with another business idea that we didn't currently have, then we might welcome her in. Let's say that Justin specializes in baking
Donut holes.
donuts and sweet items, and Libby is more of a savory and bread type baker.
I'm not. He can make the bread. I'm making the cookies.
So
You thought.
you're not-
The point.
yeah, we're not focused on why we're using this illustration. Then we might be able to welcome you in as well, and that way you're not taking business away from Justin. Now, a couple other things that would go on with this. If we had a craft guild, this specialized by the particular type of trade. So as towns got bigger, eventually they would bring in another baker into the guild to help with the numbers of people that we had. So the bakers would then create their own little community. So let's say that our town is growing. We now have Justin as the first baker. We have Libby as the second baker. And now we have Haley come in as a third baker. So all three of you,
That would not be profitable for your town.
all three of you are part of this craft guild because that is your craft, that is your specialty, is baking. And you now have your own businesses and your own little shops around town. You guys would band together, work together in order to make the best product you possibly could.
Libby and I
You-
already plugged you out.
You could also set prices, and you would have come to an agreement. You would say that we are all going to sell our donuts for the same price to make sure that nobody is going to undercut the other person. If Libby decided that she all of a sudden was going to lower her price on donuts while Justin's is overpriced, then everybody's going to go to Libby, and the two of them are going to have words, and it's not going to be pretty.
We're gonna have words.
Now, in the craft guild, it's specialized by trade. So you got a baker's guild over here. You might have a blacksmith guild over here. You might have a shoemaker's guild over here. And all of those different guilds are going to set the rules and set the quality for the products that they're going to make. They would also determine how many hours each person could work, the wages that they could earn. They would also talk about the number of employees that you're allowed to have to try to keep competition fair and try to make everything equal for each of these different businesses. Yes?
If you wanted to work extra, but you're fine with the amount of payment you're gonna get, just like work extra just because you felt like you could do that.
That may have been allowed. I don't know a good answer to that one. If they would, or if they set a hard limit on the number of hours. But one of the reasons they wanted to make sure that all three of you were playing by the same rules. So if you decided that, well, Libby's donuts seem to be a little bit better, I'm going to work extra hours to make sure that I can come up with something creative. I'm not sure if they would have allowed that or not.
Creativity is the name.
Yeah. Now, a couple of things to add to this. Each of you were accountable to each other. So if Haley's donuts were not as good of quality as what your donuts are, the two of you are going to go to her and you're going to say, listen, you either pick up the quality or you're going to be out of the guild. Now, you can get kicked out. What's the consequence if they decide to vote Haley out? What's the consequence?
Banishment.
Communication.
No, not necessarily banishment, but
I live on the streets.
if Haley's not part of the guild, then what does that mean for business?
She has no business.
She has no business, right? Because
She just
Stay on her own and just lower the price. That way she gets more business.
because of the rules of the town, you had to be a member of the guild in order to have an open business legally. So they would tell you, you've got to shut your business down. You don't have a license to be able to sell here. And because of the rules of the manor and the town charter, they formed these guilds and they had to approve everybody that could sell stuff there. So she might have to then go to a different town, try to become part of the guild in another town. So it was a really tough business to get into, and a tough way to get started. It's not like America where you can just open up a storefront, decide you're going to sell something, or start your own eBay online and start selling whatever you're making in your basement. So
Oh. What do you make, Gavin?
there you go. Within the guilds, there were certain classes. You'll probably recognize some of these from
I'm a master. She's
other things going on here. So you start off as an apprentice.
Yeah.
So as an apprentice, you'd work anywhere from 2 years up to as many as 7 years, learning underneath a master craftsman. This would be like your schooling, your education. You learn how the master does everything. You would basically work almost for free while you're doing all of this. So let's use the bakery example like we've been doing. So if Aaron decides that he wants to be a baker, he's going to come to Justin and say, can I be your apprentice? So Justin may say, yes, I'm going to teach you everything I know. So he's going to teach him how to measure the flour. He's going to teach him how to decorate the cakes. He's going to teach him how to make the best cake donuts that you've ever tasted.
And donut holes.
Right.
Right.
Therefore, he is going to pass his knowledge on to Aaron, and then Aaron may go into another town and start his own business. Or it could be that after a while, Aaron may take over the business after you decide that you retire or decide to die.
Grow old, and then he takes over Libby's business because Libby's donuts are trash.
Okay, let's not
This isn't personal.
smear somebody else.
Justin is waiting to call.
Second level is journeyman.
Justin is
So Aaron has worked for 7 years, learned everything he can from Justin. He now becomes a journeyman. This is where he goes to find more permanent employment, where he's actually going to get paid for his work. Yep.
How old is our lifespan now?
We're still in the 30s, maybe upper 30s. Yeah. So Aaron now becomes a journeyman, so he may go to a different town. He may try to find somebody that's looking for an employee that he could actually make a living wage. But the apprenticeship is almost equivalent to our high school diploma at this point. The journeyman would be a little bit more like the college degree. And then you get to the master. Many times the journeyman would choose to stay with the original master if the master was willing to hire him on as a journeyman. But if Aaron's not really, or if Justin's not at that point in his business, then he may say, sorry, you're going to have to go find somebody else to learn underneath. So the journeyman's then going to work for the master for a period of time until eventually he could become a master himself. Now, in order to become a master, Aaron would have to come before the town guild. He would have to pass an exam, which they get to ask him any question they want, and he has to respond.
What if it's not has like nothing to do with the donuts? Can they do that?
I suppose they could.
Like, what's
I
5
don't
plus
think they're-
5? And if you don't get this, you're not a master.
I suppose they could, but I don't think they
Maybe if
going
they
to do
didn't
that.
like you.
He would have to create a masterpiece. You guys ever watch those Food Network shows where they create these massive cakes and chocolates? Yeah.
No.
Yeah, or Cake Boss or something like that.
Chocolate embassy.
So Aaron would have to work on something like that, present it before the guild. So there's an oral examination where they ask you questions. There's a masterpiece that you've got to put together. And then you also, if you pass both of those, then you have to take an oath where you are going to uphold all of the rules and all of the standards that the guild places upon you. If you pass all 3 of those and you decide you want to go forward with it, then you become a master and you can open your own business in that guild, in that town. Make sense? Cool. Now, as that happens, as guilds form and as towns get bigger, now we start to see the middle class form in Western Europe.
So it was just like poor people and rich at this time.
Right. Up to this point, it has been as people are able to create their own businesses and be able to sustain themselves, now there's a little bit more of the middle class that is forming. So anybody that relied upon trade to make a living was part of this middle class. So you'd include in this group here any sort of merchant, banker, a craftsman, a skilled laborer, people that owned their own business, but they required somebody to trade with them. Either they're trading goods for goods or money for goods, would be part of this middle class. And so as we see this grow, it shows the birth of more modern society. That's the way our society works today. People are working for your attention, they're working for your money. And we see the decline in feudalism as people try to create their own business and operate on their own. This is also the first time in a long time where we have seen money is more powerful, money is greater than land. Instead of owning land and owning property, now you want to accumulate money.
Is this when the love of money comes into
No, because that was actually written before this time.
Oh, snap.
Mm-hmm.
That was before this time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Bible's already been completed at this point. So many of the middle class here, their wealth was put in their goods. You see here these ladies are wearing some pretty elaborate dresses, and that would be a sign of your social status based off the type of dress that you were wearing. Not too different than what we see today. Many
Also,
name
they had, the poofy things coming out from the waist or whatever.
that's still another couple hundred years away.
Those things are so
Wait,
Um,
so they go to it just to go back from it?
Still
Nope.
living.
These right here are pretty straight.
I know, I get that, but I thought
Yeah, that's not true.
never mind.
Yeah,
They have on
it will
the
come,
forces.
and that's a little bit more in the upper class. You're going to see those anyway. Yeah.
Gotcha.
Victoria?
What are the main differences, probably like with the how the dress and stuff that would make it? Besides
So-
the color and how they might look.
Okay, so the material that's used is definitely a sign of your social status. The color, because dyed material was more expensive than just plain colored material. The quality of it, the layers involved, when you look at that, the more layers that you wore, the more clothing you could afford. As
You'd be,
well,
like extra hot if I would want to do that.
It shows your wealth. Be popular.
so
Would you
that
rather be wealthy or be hot? Because I'd rather be.
well, so when we learned about Europe last year in geography, we learned that there's a varied climate. So certain times of the year it's cold, certain times of the year it is warm. So those warmer months, you'd wear materials that are not as heavy and not as
Justin
warm.
protects for winter.
Oh,
okay.
Doesn't look like winter, but okay.
Is that a good enough answer for you?
Yes, sir.
Great.
They're not in the
The correct answer was no. Sorry.
So very similar to the way you'd see today, there are certain name brands that people associate with social status. As much as we may deny it, there are things that are more expensive, and maybe on our mind, on our Christmas list, you want that there. Wealth continues to grow. As people are able to purchase more stuff, as they make more money, and they're able to buy similar goods and similar clothing as to what the lords of the land had owned, that now the people who are living in the towns really have as good of a life as the people living in the castles and the nobility. However, they don't own as much land. They don't have their own castle. But yet they live the lifestyle of the rich and famous. So it's kind of like many people in today's society. We want to live that type of lifestyle, but we can't afford it. And so we'll do things to make it seem like we're living that lifestyle. We'll buy things on credit. We'll take out loans for things we really can't afford. Many of the houses that are being built today, they're building smaller and smaller houses with nicer furnishings inside of it so that, well, people know they can't afford a large house with the nice furnishings, so they can afford a smaller house with the nice furnishings. And that is a huge trend in
People like those
real estate.
tiny houses.
Some yes, but that's not really what we're talking about here with that. We're talking about like smaller square footage for that. The power of the nobility is weakened here as well, because nobility no longer have any sort of control over you. If you are now able to earn money on your own and able to sustain life on your own, you don't really need the nobility for anything. And so this is where we see feudalism begin to decline and fall apart to the point where towns take over. Now, when you live in a town, a few things you need to know about living in these towns. You had an enclosed wall around the town for protection.
So now this is when I
This right here.
Looks exactly like from Les Mis. Like the town that they're in when they have the war and everyone dies and there's blood all over the streets. That's exactly what it looks like. Exactly.
So I don't know what the exact time setting of that.
It was the
What?
June Rebellion.
The what?
The June Rebellion in like 1700s.
Okay,
Like
so
1760s.
yeah, we're getting close to that. We're still probably.
Are we gonna study that?
No, but we're gonna. Many of the buildings that are built here would have been still standing at that time. So that's probably why it's going to look similar.
Michelle, obviously.
What?
So why would we have enclosed walls around the town? What's the purpose? Protect from invaders. Do you as a town have an army?
No.
You might
No.
have a militia, maybe.
Maybe a group of people that are going to band together, but do we have a trained set of soldiers and knights?
No.
No, because all those people have now started their own bakeries and they are baking bread for a living, not fighting other people for a living. So your only sort of protection are these enclosed walls. Now, if we have an enclosed town, what happens when we get more people in the town? What do we do with them?
You need to expand.
We got to expand. We can't move the walls, so where do we expand to?
Underground.
No?
Higher ground.
Yes. So we start building up. Yes, ma'am.
I was wrong. It's from 1832.
Oh, yeah, we're still, yeah, okay. But yet some of those buildings, yeah, they were
That's exactly what
They were
it's like
built
over
and restored many times, so it could be very similar. Yeah. So those enclosed walls meant that we were going to have to build homes close together and have to build them up high. So when you go to some of these old towns, narrow streets are really common because of this factor, because we have a lot of people in a small, narrow street. So very crowded housing, narrow streets, a lot of dark and dirty corners of town, places that would not be very pleasant to walk through. There are no street lights at this point.
Do they have electricity?
No, electricity is still a few hundred years away. So yeah, they'd use candles, they'd use lamps. They would use oil lamps and stuff to light their way. So many of the towns could be smelled from miles away. And it was not just visible, you could smell the stench from a long, long distance away, because sanitation was so poor that they had nowhere to dispose of the waste product other than the streets. And so all of the plumbing issues that we would deal with on a regular basis would just be out there in the streets. Most of the no. So in these homes, they had no indoor plumbing. Stop humming. So they would have a little bucket in the corner of the house, and that bucket then would be dumped out of the second story window
Do
most
they
often.
still have aqueducts?
No, aqueducts are not in this part of Europe. That would have been Rome, and they were no longer functional at this point. They what? Yeah, so
When did they come up with the sewage system?
sewage system is still not for a couple more hundred years. They are going to develop that because of the necessity we're going to see here. Yep. Cool. Very nice.
So did the lifespan decrease with like the sanitation problems in the towns?
It was already, lifespan was already pretty short, so I'm going to say no. But this is part of the reason why lifespan is so short. Yeah. Yeah, pretty close. Sewage system would have been first before electricity.
And is this like around the time when the plague occurred?
That's exactly where we're headed. Yep. So, despite all of these negative factors of the town was the exciting place to be. Because that's where all the people were.
In all the balls.
Now,
Did you say in all the bowls?
Balls. You know, like for the dance.
Oh, I thought you said bowls.
okay, so all the people were here. Think about life out on the feudal system. You did not have any kind of social life. Now you have an opportunity for that. Okay, so town life is exciting. The center of activity was a town square. The merchants and traders that came through, they brought new things that you'd never seen before, and this was the place to buy them.
So when they open their walls up for traders.
Yes. I want to draw a connection here to Arendelle and the Frozen Movie, but I'm not sure that's going to be really accurate. When they open up and all these traders come in for the coronation, and it's kind of that type of thing.
Open the
Oh
gate.
my
That's
word.
how you know that.
He knows.
Arendelle.
Yeah. Remember last year we talked about that with fjords?
Yeah.
We talked about that in geography today. So,
We talked about that in geography last year.
Was it
Yeah.
inaccurate?
no, I just said how they are some of the, most people when they think of a fjord, they think of the one in Arendelle.
What is a fjord?
It's a geographical feature where there's a steep hillside leading down to water that's protected by
That's the fjord.
protected by land.
That's one with the J. That's why. Like this one we were talking about.
So let's talk about the Black Death. Yeah.
I got you.
No, that's
So Black Death hit its peak between 1347 and 1350.
Oh, dang, not this.
1347 to 1350. Now, the disease had been going on prior to this, but it
rats.
really hits Europe hard in these 3 years. So it begins in Sicily, at least on the European side of things, begins in Sicily, in the harbor there. And this is perhaps the most devastating natural disaster that's ever happened in Europe.
Oh my gosh.
When it's all said and done, about 33% of all the Europeans are dead. So 1 out of every 3 would have survived. So if you look at the people in your row, only 1 out of the rest of you would still be living by the time this is all done in the next 3 years.
Wait, I thought you said.
I'm sorry, 1/3 die. Yeah, so 1 out of the 3. You're right. I'm sorry, I got that backwards. So which of the 3 of you is going to volunteer? You volunteer? Okay.
I
To
wanna
die.
do it.
Yes.
Mr.
To
Joe.
die.
Volunteering to
Doesn't
die.
that look like
I
a
volunteer
red
to
monster
die.
between eyes?
I will die.
Okay. There you go.
You let me die.
Yeah, because you're
You're just volunteering.
You let me die.
Okay,
That's why you're gonna
that's
die.
completely different.
So here's where it comes from.
You just got mad when you were saying.
A black Asian
So-
rat.
This.
I didn't know I was true.
Hey, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you. So it began over in Asia and really in the Mongolian Empire. Mongolian Empire is where it all began. And we've talked about the Mongols. We've talked about their habits and what they were doing to destroy people. Some people use that as a basis for this disease where their killing practices led to this disease. We don't know for sure. We know it comes over from Asia. The disease actually is carried by fleas that usually attach themselves to the black Asian rat. That rat got on board some of the ships that were coming over from Asia, coming into Europe. Justin, turn around.
Okay.
Thank you.
Yeah.
And that is how it ended up getting into Europe. So many people over in Asia had already been dying as a result of this disease. And it ends up getting carried over here into Europe. And this bacteria that's carried by the fleas, can be transmitted by a flea bite to a human. And then once a human has it, then all they have to do is they have to come up and have contact with you. So in some cases, it can be it can be transferred through the air. Other times, it has to be a personal contact, and we'll talk about that here in just a moment as well.
Contact through contact.
Yeah, well, they can get bit by fleas.
Could it be contact through contact? Like you touch a donut and you have the plague, and then you give it to someone else?
Some forms of it could, yes. Now, here's the two different forms of this disease. The first one is the bubonic plague. So bubonic is an infection of the blood system. So it would infect your bloodstream. It would show up in the fact that your lymph nodes underneath your neck would turn black and swell really, really large. Yeah, pretty gross. They would expand so large that they would begin to fester and ooze. Your skin, no, it wouldn't suffocate you quite yet. Your skin would begin to show black blotches on your skin. You would show up with a fever, boils, and
What, your beard boils, or do you have boils?
you'd have fever and you'd have boils, like the skin boils that are festering and oozing all kinds of nastiness. This would go on for about 5 days.
And then you die.
You'd have these symptoms. Well, not quite. So after 5 days, you would either die in those 5 days, or you would begin to heal. And you had a 50-50 chance of survival.
Are you for real?
So then that means like 2 people would get the first stage, but then like only one of them would
Yeah.
actually
Yep. So this is the bubonic form of it. Okay. There's 2 forms. If you got the blood system, you knew that you had a 50% chance of survival. And you knew even if you survived, it was going to be pretty awful. Remember we talked about Justinian, how he got really, really sick? This is what he had, and he was one that survived. But even after his survival, it affected his mentality, it affected his personality for the rest of his life. So he was not back to normal 100%, but he did survive the bubonic plague. Yes?
Do we still have this disease, just medicine for it now?
Yes. It's almost been eradicated, but every once in a while there will be a outbreak where it'll happen. Usually it's in a third world country of some sort or in Africa somewhere, and they'll send in medication to help deal with it because they have figured out a way to combat it.
So it was like when everybody got that,
Ebola?
yeah.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember the name.
Yeah. And people were concerned that Ebola was going to turn into the new bubonic plague.
That would have been terrible. They'll
Yeah.
have died.
Yeah, it would have been pretty bad.
Ebola cured now?
They have a cure for it, yes.
Is he?
That's right.
I was just gonna ask, are there still black Asian rats and all that stuff?
I don't know.
There's still what?
No, I don't know.
Like, they're still-
I would guess there is, but they were only the carriers. They weren't the ones that actually spread it. They just brought the fleas over. Now, the second form is pneumonic.
Like pneumonia?
Like pneumonia, yeah. No, pneumonia and pneumonic plague are 2 very different things. But the reason why it sounds the same is because it has to do with your lungs. Okay, so pneumonia has to do with your lungs. Pneumonic plague has to do with your lungs as well. So it is an infection of your lungs for the pneumonic plague that is extremely contagious because the bubonic plague, while it is contagious, you have to have a transfer of bodily fluid in order to transfer that one from one person to the next. So if I have an open wound and I give you a high five and you have an open wound, then I'm probably giving you bubonic plague. Chances of that happening are less than pneumonic because all I have to do to give you pneumonic plague is cough and you breathe in the same air I just coughed out because it's transferred by the air molecules in the contact or the air that you breathe, and if I have it, I infect the air, then you're going to get it by breathing that in. So what happens here with the pneumonic plague is that it was much more contagious than bubonic for that reason. You would start off with a very small, very light fever. You'd have a cough that at first didn't seem like a whole lot of anything, would gradually get a little bit worse, until eventually you started to cough up blood. Then you knew that there was a serious problem going on. You'd start to show signs of weakness, fatigue, apathy, and usually you were dead within 24 hours of the first symptom.
Do you have any risk of surviving?
You had a 0 chance of survival.
Whoa.
Back then.
Every case that was studied, every case that was documented from the pneumonic plague was 100% deadly. So nobody that they know of survived that. Now, again, there are ways to treat that today, but back then there were not. This is why the plague was so awful, was because all it took was somebody coughing, and it would put the disease out in the air, and then if somebody else came and breathed that in, then they would contract that as well.
That's
So
what
it was really short.
Yeah, it was quick. I mean, 24 hours or less till you were dead. So when that happened, then you've got all these people dying and you don't know what to do with them. Well,
Throw them over the wall.
yeah, you could take them outside of the city and bury them, burn them, try to do that. But who's going to take those bodies?
That means 2 people got 24 hours to get it all done and then throw themselves in the fire too. That's what
I'm not volunteering to do that because I don't want to catch it. But at the same time, if we don't get rid of those bodies, then what's going to happen?
But isn't it just like in the air though? So as long as you like cover your mouth and all that good stuff.
You were one of the massive doctors wearing.
Okay, well, we're talking 1300s here.
So you pull
Alright.
your shirt up a
Okay.
little higher.
Chance? Yes. I mean, that's giving you the best opportunity to survive and to keep from getting it. But
Oh, she's got it. She's got it. She got it.
Not coughing up blood, because
But-
I've been coughing for days.
are you volunteering to go out and remove those bodies, even covering up your face?
I need y'all give me some sun.
I doubt you are. So, let's talk about the reactions. What do people do? As they realized that this was a pretty big deal, there were some people that decide to leave the country. Either they leave the affected area or they might leave Europe altogether. They try to go find a new place. Just a second, try it. Julie, what'd you say? Yeah, because when this plague hits, it's like such a big natural disaster that if you want to leave, leave. That's fine. Shannon, what'd you say?
I said where to go with them if it's in the air. Like,
Well, if they
if
had,
they don't know if they have it and
Right.
they go, it's still with them.
yes, correct. If they don't have any symptoms yet, they might be okay. They could start showing symptoms a little bit later on. But typically the symptoms start pretty quickly. So that's why they tried to leave the country before they started showing symptoms. Some people just lived in terror. I mean, if you had nowhere to go or you couldn't afford to go anywhere else, you just sat there.
Bundled up in your house.
Yes, you stay bundled up in your house, hoping that nobody in your household gets it, hoping that you can survive. And that's really what a lot of people did because they couldn't go anywhere.
They would
Haley?
have gone and get food
The
and
people
water.
that left the country, wouldn't they have just spread the disease?
Yeah, that's what Cheyenne was saying
That's
here.
what I was saying.
Is that there's a good chance they did. But if they could get out of there before they started showing symptoms of it or before it really hit their town hard, maybe a couple people had it and they just got out of there quickly, then they might have been able to outrun it. And there were some that did.
Could the disease be spread through clothing? Could it get in your clothing and get other people sick?
Not that I'm aware of, unless it's a bodily fluid. And again, they don't have laundromats or washing machines like we do, so they wear their clothes pretty extensively. So the people who do stay behind and live in terror, we talked about the amount of bodies that are left behind. They don't know what to do with them. They also don't really know what the cause is. All they know is that people are getting sick. They don't know where it's coming from. Now, we have studied this and we know where it came from, but at that time they were just understanding that people started dying and they didn't know how to stop it. So there were a lot of people that continued to spread the problem by their unsanitary conditions. There were people who were, of course, the bodies were piling up and without people willing to carry the bodies out, those bodies were sitting in the disease-infested streets. They already had disease there, and then you have more bodies that are infested with disease, and it just builds and builds and builds and gets worse and worse and worse. So there were some reactions and responses here. Some of the results of all of this. First of all, you have some mass hysteria. People are panicking and freaking out, and for pretty good reason. There were these people called flagellants, and they believed that this was God's judgment for their sin. So they decided that if they punish themselves by beating themselves up, by flogging themselves, that God may show mercy on them and take away this disease. This was a pretty extreme view, but there were many people that would try to show their repentance through physical punishment of themselves to have grace, have God's mercy put upon them. There's also the massacre of Jews, where they believed that it was a Jewish problem, that the Jews were the cause of this. So we can't look at Hitler and say, well, he's the only one that's persecuted the Jews, because Europe did that long before him. So many times it was the flagellants that were targeting the Jews and saying, it's your fault, it's your problem. You don't believe that Christ is the Son of God, and so therefore you are the reason why we are experiencing all this pain, suffering, and death. As the disease spread, there is less morality, more crime. People take on the mentality of, well, I'm going to die anyway. I might as well live life to the fullest and do whatever I want. Nobody's going to stop me. And so they go out and they really do whatever they want.
Do you think they would be considering what would happen after?
Well, at this point, they don't know if there's some people who believe this is the end of the world. That this is the way God is choosing to end the world, is through this disease and death.
Like, why would they go out and do kind of, especially the Catholics who believe in works?
That's
kind of bad stuff.
That's a really good question. That's a really good point. Because clearly they'd have to pay that off in purgatory if they were a good Catholic and they knew to do that. Yeah. Now, there's decline in population. I mentioned that a third of Europe dies through all of this. So this was, in some ways, a natural response to the overcrowding in the cities. Now the cities are no longer overcrowded.
Oh, that's a good thing. Yeah.
A lot of social unrest goes on here. People who are blaming and pointing fingers at others for what's happening. The lower class is blaming the upper class. The upper class is blaming the lower class. Yeah. And then finally here, last thing is that there's a lot of discontentment with the Catholic Church.
Where's RCC?
Roman Catholic Church, yes. So the people believe that the Catholic Church was not doing enough and not helping them out with